Occupy is everywhere, even the heartlands of Mexico. It's a small group. We were not so small during the high season, January, February, March, when there were a lot of folks from El Norte on vacation here. We regularly had 30, 35, 40 people at our weekly General Assemblies. But now that they've all flown back north, our numbers have diminished. And our role here in Mexico has been somewhat limited by Article 33 of the Mexican Constitution, which prohibits foreigners from participating in Mexican politics. And although we probably could have done more than we did, there were people who were nervous about being sent out of the country and, with their house and everything left behind here. So, but in any case, as a result, the role of Occupy Wall Street here has been mainly an educational one. And that's largely the role of the Center for Global Justice as well. Let me just say a word about that. The Center for Global Justice has been here for 8 years. It was founded by several retired academics from the United States. I was one of the 3 founders. I didn't introduce myself, did I? I'm Cliff Durant, right? Former philosophy professor. And the other 2 founders were another philosophy professor, Bob Stone, and his wife, Betsy Bowman, a French literature teacher. So a group of humanists who came to Mexico because we wanted, we'd always been politically active, critics of globalization, and we wanted to be able to better understand globalization from the point of view of the global South. So that's why we came to Mexico. And as I say, the role of the Center for Global Justice is largely one that's educational. We put on programs. This is the low season now, but during the high season, we show 2 documentary films per week, and we have at least one panel or talk per week on a variety of social issues. And they're all generally very well attended, and it's become a part of the culture of San Miguel. There are many visitors to San Miguel who report they come back each year attracted to San Miguel because of the lively discussions that go on here on relevant issues. We also have started running educational trips to Cuba. This year we have 3 trips. I'm taking a group next month. A group of about 50 people, mainly from the U.S. We have one of those prized Treasury Department people-to-people licenses that makes it legal for us to take anybody to Cuba on an educationally oriented trip. And so that's a new area that we've opened up. But I don't want to go on and on about that. I did want to call your attention to the fact that we passed a sign-up sheet around if you want to be on the email list of the center. And we also have 3 books in the back of the room available for sale. First is a book by Rathke, Citizen Wealth, Winning the Campaign to Save Working Families, about the work of ACORN. And all of these books are being sold at a special discounted price today. This one, $20 or 200 pesos. Another new book, Global Grassroots, Perspectives on International Organizing, about ACORN International, including articles by some of the people that you'll be meeting here today. And that's 150 pesos. And then the new book from the Center for Global Justice that that I and a colleague have put together, Recreating Democracy in a Globalized State. It's a series of articles about the impact of globalization on nation states, transforming them into globalized states that serve the interests of transnational corporations rather than their national populations. It's a number of articles by my co-editor Steve and myself, and a number of articles by Cubans as well, so which makes it a unique book. And that also is discounted at 200 pesos. So, I'll be available in the back afterwards if you want to browse through the books or purchase them. But let me turn the floor over to Dilcia who will be presiding and introducing the panel.
Thank you, Lee. Well, hi everyone. My name is Dilcia. I had the privilege to work both for ACORN and for the Center for Global Justice. So it kind of made sense, I guess, that I was the person introducing the panel. And something very important, who doesn't speak English? ¿Quién no habla inglés para nada? Entonces vamos a traducir. Okay. I'm going to be translating from English into Spanish for them, and I'm going to be translating from Spanish into English for Dilcia. The idea is to have 10 minutes, 10 minutitos de plática cada uno, and then leave place for questions and answers. I encourage you to buy those books that people were showing, because they're pretty good. Nice side table book. So please, you're also going to be supporting two very important organizations. I don't want to, overextend about introducing all of them, so I'm not going to introduce you, and I'm not going to introduce you. I'm going to introduce Wade. Wade Rathke has been an organizer for
many years.
Many years. Many years. So founder of ACORN International, ACAU. It was great working for you, Wade. I learned a lot, and hopefully you will let us know a little bit about what you're doing with ACORN International and stuff. Estoy diciendo básicamente que fue un placer trabajar con Wade, que ha sido un organizador durante muchos años y que ojalá nos pueda contar en qué punto está ACORN International en este momento en las oficinas. Sí.
Thank you, Dilcia. And I have to tell you first how wonderful it is to be back in San Miguel. I was here, January of last year,
Right.
and the center asked me invited me to speak briefly, and we had a great, one of those special San Miguel nights. In the late evening, the weather was beautiful. It went several hours, and I can't remember when I've had more fun talking about organizing with a group of Mexicanos, Canadians, Estados Unidos folks. So when we decided to have our international staff and board meeting in Mexico City, I thought what a fantastic experience it would be for our organizers, many of whom are from Canada here today, and Honduras, and Mexico, and the United States, to have a chance to come up to San Miguel and get a sense of this community and all it represents. And that was not in the library here in the Biblioteca, which is what a special place to talk about the work and the setting we have here. So I want to thank Dilcia and Cliff for sponsoring us, giving me an excuse to bring people to San Miguel. So, chief organizer, ACORN International. ACORN International is less than 10 years old. Had ACORN survived in the United States, it would have been 41 years old almost now. It began on June 18th of 1970. The work, and I'll answer any questions later about what happened to ACORN in the United States from my perspective if people have some. But we learn from our experiences in organizing all the time. And I'm often reminded, just to briefly address that social movements are very rare to last as long as 40 years. I don't take much comfort in that, but it is certainly something that's very true. ACORN International is a federation, a global federation of affiliates that work in some 12, 13 countries, the largest of which is Canada, and I'm going to introduce Judy Duncan in a minute to talk more about what the work of ACORN Canada continues to be. But ACORN International still continues the project of building membership organizations of the poor in these countries. We have organizing operations largely in many of the countries we've worked in the mega slums. That's what in the Mesa outside of Mexico City, La Matanza outside of Buenos Aires, San Juan de Argancho outside of Lima, Peru. You'll hear more about our work in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula from Dilcia in a minute. But in these and in Korogocho and Nairobi and Dharavi and Mumbai and we also work in Delhi and Bangalore and other cities in India. What we found is that if people have the opportunity, no matter how poor, to come together and work in a concerted, collective way and support their organization, they can still win victories that have to do with fundamental, in many of these areas, fundamental human rights, the right to water, the ability to access school and education, which is a campaign recently we won in Nairobi. Dilcia might talk about the winning the water campaign in Ramon, Colonias Ramon. But these issues, 2 years ago, we all had a similar meeting in Lima. And Lima, our project in Lima was the first place we started organizing 10 years ago after the change of government opened up civil society. And we were invited to see if we could help by many of what were our members at that time who lived in the United States, particularly in California and New Jersey, who fled the repressive regimes and ended up in the United States, and when it opened up and Fujimori was displaced and Toledo became the president, they convinced us to go down. We weren't sure how we could help. Ercilia went there a number of times when she was working with ACORN International. We ended up with a very exciting project in San Juan de Argancho, and we showed everybody the stairways built up the hillsides where there had been nothing but makeshift housing, the water projects that had been established, the school that had been built, the park, the streets that were paved. In many ways, you said after 8 years, what an exciting, what a wonderful level of accomplishment. But even so, you were looking at housing that was still inadequate with dirt floors and outhouses, so to speak, behind them. So the project of ACORN International, particularly in these large mega slums, is one that doesn't encourage you to ever get the big hit. Every victory sort of points out really how long the road is. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But what we found is even in these times of difficult organizing experiences, there are still huge victories that people can win by working together, even with scant resources. The other projects that are interesting as well that have come recently to ACORN International are in developed countries that we had never really planned to organize on originally. We have a very interesting operation in Rome now, with a lot of interest in Sicily. If you'd ever told me I'd even get to go to Rome, I would have said, liar, liar, pants on fire. And here's how it happens. You've read the papers, the euro is in trouble, the economies of all these countries are in difficult shape. What that's meant is that sometimes in the revenue producing measures passed by parliaments in places like Italy, there are organizing opportunities. So a year ago, because there's a huge black market in terms of rental housing, not only in Rome but throughout Italy, the Parliament passed a series of legislation which was trying to force the black market to become transparent. So landlords were given until June 2nd, a year ago, to finally record their property as income producing, and tenants as well had some opportunities there. After June 2nd, if a landlord didn't put their property on the rolls as part of their income for taxation purposes, if tenants could prove that this property existed and turned in that property, they then could get a reduction of 85 to 90% of what their rent had been for the period of an Italian lease. Well, an Italian lease is 4 years guaranteed and 4 years option. So essentially, if your rent was 1,000 euros in Rome, your new rent after you turned in that property went down to 100 to 150 euros for 8 years. So within 2 months, we had a 4 million euro savings that people have been able to achieve. You might think in Rome this would mainly have to do with students. That's actually not who benefited, because students see themselves as transient in the housing and are victims of the black market, but there's too much of what I would call a wink and nod between landlords saying, hey, I'll give you a little bit less rent, you don't report my property, and it continues the black market. But for working families caught in economic pressures, this has become a huge inducement for them to both properly turn in property for taxation and receive what you might call as a bounty for having done so and putting property on the rolls. The other thing that's been interesting in Italy is in Sicily. You've probably heard a lot about this thing, mothers and fathers in America. I think it's abbreviated in Italy to call it the mafia, but there's a huge movement of building civic movements. And so in all communities, Palermo, Catania, Paterno, etc., in Sicily, a number of civic movements have been organized to sort of retake political authority for citizens. And citizen movements in Italy can even access the ballot immediately and contend for elective office and compete with existing parties. So in some communities like Syracuse and outside of Catania and some other communities are competing directly with the existing political formations to try to bring civic reform. These are the kinds of things that an organization like ACORN International, that has the experience in dealing both with membership organizations, citizen engagement, as well as issue campaigns, turns out to have a significant role. The biggest campaign we've been involved in has to do with remittances. I actually talked about this January a year ago when I was here, because we were just starting. And I'm delighted to say finally the first country is going to introduce legislation to regulate remittances here, May 31st in Ottawa. We have delegates from the NDP that are putting this bill into the hopper, and finally we'll be able to have a discussion in Canada. We had a very interesting meeting in Honduras about similarly trying to give Social Security rights to migrants and perhaps to extend that to remittances. So it's a big world out there, and we're having making some interesting progress. But obviously what's exciting today about being in San Miguel is having my comrades here with me, my compañeras and compañeros. So I'm going to first introduce Dilcia Zavala, who's our head organizer in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, who will speak in Spanish, and so they will help us out about what the organizing looks like in a very new office over the last year and a half, 2 years in Tegucigalpa. Gracias.
Mi nombre es Dilcia Zavala, soy organizadora de ACORN International de Tegucigalpa. Y bueno, ACORN en Tegucigalpa comenzó desde julio del 2010 y bueno, hemos estado organizando una cantidad de barrios pobres en todo Tegucigalpa. Comenzamos con la colonia Ramón Amaya Amador y nos hemos extendido aproximadamente como a 10 barrios. Y
Okay, so good morning, my name is Dilcia Zavala. I'm an ACORN organizer in Honduras, Tegucigalpa. Just says Tegucigalpa started in June, Julio. July 2010. They started working in a number of low-income neighborhoods around Tegucigalpa. And the first one they started working on was San Ramón. Ramón Amaya Amador. You gotta say like that. Yeah.
Y bueno, ACORN está trabajando sobre un contexto nacional bien fuerte. Estamos después de un golpe de Estado con un desequilibrio económico, social, político, religioso.
So ACORN has, the context of the work of ACORN in Honduras, they come after a very bad coup d'etat, which created a disbalance in economic terms, political terms, social terms, religious terms. So it's a very hardship environment they're working.
Y enseñarle a la gente poder organizarse dejando a un lado todos estos problemas que están llevando para poder lograr que su comunidad pueda avanzar ha sido un reto muy grande.
And the biggest challenge has been how to organize people and make them understand that they have to leave all those personal issues aside in order to work together. That has been the biggest challenge for them.
A partir del golpe de Estado, Honduras cayó en una deuda interna y externa muy grande, donde todos los proyectos sociales fueron cancelados, donde no hay seguro social para toda la gente, donde no hay servicios médicos eficientes, donde no hay trabajo, donde no hay comida. Tenemos un serio problema de que todos los productos de alto consumo son importados y las comunidades.
Oh, okay. So after the coup d'etat, basically Honduras fell into this huge internal and external debt. So all social projects that claim for public support were cancelled. There was no governmental support for those programs. And right now they find themselves in a situation where there's no real social security, health, public policies, seguro social, de salud. Okay.
Y bueno, ante todo tenemos un problema sobre criminalización, una gran tasa de homicidios, hay grandes cantidades de personas que están siendo asesinados y asesinadas, la penetración de los grupos de narcotráfico y ante todo la gran intrusión de Estados Unidos con sus políticas neoliberales, donde se quiere militarizar toda la región, comenzando desde México y terminando hasta Colombia. Tenemos bases militares y hay prácticas incluso de armas nucleares y el problema de la militarización en toda la región.
So in this context of poverty, basically what they are noticing now is two things. On the one hand is narco-traffic. So we have a huge race of narco-traffic and gangs that they didn't used to have. And parallel is the whole militarization of the area from the United States, with their, on the one hand, neoliberal policies and then militarization, as Dilcia was saying, from Mexico to Colombia, the poor regions with military bases, nuclear weapon practices as well.
Y bueno, ante todo un panorama desastroso que tenemos en Honduras, ACORN está trabajando en temas puntuales como ser el acceso a agua a las colonias, la seguridad de algunos barrios donde estamos trabajando, donde los vecinos y las vecinas hacen el papel que tiene que ser la Policía Nacional.
So in this, you know, the perspective it doesn't look good clearly. So what is ACORN doing? Well, they are working on very specific issues. One of them is water. The other one, in some of the neighborhoods that she was mentioning, low-income neighborhoods, they're working on safety issues. There's huge crime rates have escalated because of the fact that, you know, the state is gone and there's poverty and all the factors that make this happen. And now she's saying the neighbors are doing the role that the police should be having taken over, but it's neighbors that are doing that.
También estamos trabajando con una comunidad muy especial que se llama Manzanales, que ha sido una comunidad desalojada de sus viviendas, y estamos pues muy contentos porque después de mucho tiempo de peleas y de saqueo y de que a la población les quitaron completamente sus casas, llegaron con máquinas y deshicieron todas las viviendas, pues a través de gestiones que se hicieron con las autoridades se pudo recuperar la tierra.
They're also working with this community. The name of the community is Manzanales, and the problem there is that everybody was evicted. All the neighbors there got evicted. Basically, they came with bulldozing the whole area. So through a lot of work with the government, they've been able to recover their houses, recover their properties. So slowly they're moving back in.
También la colonia Ramón Amaya logró tener desde hace 25 años, logró tener el año pasado agua potable, limpia.
So this colonia Ramón Amaya, the one we mentioned first, after 25 years, they've been able to access potable water.
Y también seguimos con la campaña de justicias, remesas con justicia, donde desde el año pasado estamos presionando a través del Congreso Nacional que haya una ley donde pueda haber una regulación para los cobros de las tasas, ya que en Honduras es del 15 al 20% por cada envío que se hace de Estados Unidos. Sabemos de que esto está dejando más ricas a estas empresas remesadoras y más pobres a las familias, y les quita el derecho de poder regresar a nuestros países a poder seguir con su vida, con sus familias.
They're also working in the context of this fair remittances campaign. They're working in Honduras, we did as well. In Honduras, the interest rate whenever you send money is 15 to 20%. So basically, with that fair, the only ones that are getting richer and richer are the companies that do the wire transfer, not the people and the families that are sending the money. And it's also sort of making the families that are outside not being able to send the whole amount of money, the 100% or the 95%, and eventually, you know, working for the remittances companies more than for the families.
Y actualmente estamos también con una nueva campaña que estamos viendo cómo la vamos a empezar a realizar, que es el acceso del seguro social para los migrantes en Estados Unidos, que es una campaña que no solamente se realizaría en Honduras con las familias, sino que en Estados Unidos, en Canadá y en algunos países de Europa, y esperamos de que realmente la familia de los inmigrantes y las inmigrantes puedan tener acceso al seguro social.
¿Que están en Estados Unidos?
En Estados Unidos, en Canadá y en Europa.
Okay, and another one campaign that they started working is access to social security for families that are, you know, originating from different places in Latin America, but that are living in either the States or Canada or certain places in Europe. So access to social security is one of their latest campaigns.
Okay. Y ahora quiero presentarles a nuestro compañero Luis, que es el organizador de San Pedro Sula. Él está trabajando en otra de las ciudades. Y también a Patti Martínez, que ella es miembro de
So Luis is an ACORN organizer and Pat is an ACORN member.
Okay.
Vale,
Gracias.
Gracias.
It's Cliff had pointed out to me the article about this presentation, and the irony that somehow in the United States ACORN was having problems surviving almost at the same time the repression was coming in Honduras, and ACORN International was being invited in to work with groups in Honduras. So it's a big world out there with some contradictions you might notice. But we're very proud of the work we're doing in Honduras. If you ever wanted to know, though, what ACORN might have looked like if it had continued to survive and thrive, there's a biological principle that John Anderson in Vancouver did the research to figure out. That's sort of one of these biodiversity things that happens in islands with, you know, limited outside interference. It's sort of sometimes they jump to a new host and grow and develop. Well, in some ways that's what's happened in Canada, where we still have living wage campaigns, we still have housing campaigns, we still have neighborhood campaigns, and we have a growing organization that the head organizer, Judy Duncan, who's based in Toronto, will talk about, that now has 70,000, 60,000, 80,000, I can't keep up with the
45.
45,000, well, whatever.
Next year.
Yeah, I'm reading the goals for next year, and I'm already saying that we've got it, which is harder. But this is Judy Duncan, and we'll talk about ACORN Canada.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Judy Duncan. I'm the head organizer of ACORN Canada. And just to give you a quick overview, we started in 2004, and the model that we're using is exactly the same as ACORN US. And right now we have 4 offices across the country, and we operate essentially in 8 different municipalities from those offices. And we have 45,000 members, and are people here familiar with Canada in the back? Somewhat, John?
So we brought our own crowd.
We have an office in New Westminster, which is right outside of Vancouver. So it's kind of similar to San Francisco, where it's a very expensive city, so people can't really afford to live there. So we service essentially 4 different municipalities from the New West office. And then in Ontario, we have 3 different offices. Do you want me to stop for a second?
Yeah, maybe.
Ooh,
You want to just bring them up closer to you?
Yeah, maybe. ¿Quieren venir aquí y yo les traduzco a ustedes? Porque no están entendiendo nada, ¿sí? I mean, she speaks very slow.
Yeah, right.
Entonces está diciendo que se van a poner con Canadá, que tienen 4 oficinas, trabajan en 8 diferentes ciudades. Que el modelo organizativo que tienen es básicamente el mismo modelo organizativo que tenía en los Estados Unidos. I kind of summed it up.
Yeah.
Okay. So in Ontario, we have 3 offices, and most recently we have kind of an active membership base in Cape Breton on the East Coast. That we don't have an office there yet, but we're trying to get an office. But we do have an organizer there who's a volunteer. So I was just going to really quickly go over kind of the mechanics of how we work, so people kind of understand what the community organizing model that we use. So we spend most of our resources going door to door in low and moderate income neighborhoods, talking to people about what their issues are, and then talking to people about individually we can't make a change, but collectively we can. And what ACORN's doing is bringing people together to make changes collectively on the issues that they've identified. So the first city in Canada that we worked in was Toronto, and we did our first organizing drive, which essentially took about 2 months. And, so we did a lot of door knocking, and the members that joined decided to work on tenant issues in Toronto. So at that point, we did an action and, fought for very localized demands in a couple of different apartment buildings around bringing the buildings up to the legal standard, because there was actually laws on the books, but there was no enforcement. So that was one organizing drive, and then we did 3 other organizing drives in Toronto, and at that point we then had a citywide board that was made up of the leaders that had been elected in the local organizing drive. So, for example, the Toronto local board is made up of the leaders from each chapter, the chairs from each chapter, and they sit on the citywide board. And that exact process was replicated across the country in Ottawa, in New Westminster, in Surrey, in Burnaby. We're just starting in Vancouver, in Hamilton, and we're just starting in Cape Breton. So municipally across the country, probably the biggest campaign that we fought is around tenant issues. So in Toronto, we fought for a landlord licensing system for probably about 6 years. And we were close to winning landlord licensing, but what we actually won was this program called an MRAP program, which was a comprehensive audit program, which was similar to what we wanted, and resulted in hundreds of $50 million of landlords investing in the apartment buildings from this program. In the other municipalities that we've been fighting for tenant issues, there's been less laws on the books, so we've started out of BC our Healthy Homes campaign. So we're fighting for healthy homes bylaws in Surrey, in Burnaby, in Ottawa, and in Cape Breton. And so the most advanced stage that's gone is in Surrey. We've actually had the bylaw drafted, and we're waiting for it to get passed through council, and it looks good there. In Ottawa and in Cape Breton, we just launched the campaign, and our membership is very actively working on lobbying the local councillors to kind of win support on this bylaw that we're fighting for. So other municipal campaigns that we've been working on are the living wage campaign. So this is, and again, a bylaw at the municipal level that ties any government money being spent in contracts or in direct city jobs to be paid at a certain wage level. So we launched that campaign both in New Westminster, in British Columbia, and in Ottawa, in Ontario. And we won the first and highest living wage law in Canada, and the highest in North America in New West, which was a huge victory for us nationally. And the original number was 1674. Is that right, John? But now it's higher, and I've lost track of the number. So I can't count that back.
19 now.
So, wow, it's at 19 now.
Just lean back and watch it run.
So yeah, in Ottawa, that campaign's on a pause. Wait to re-attack later. So, provincially, we've also done a lot of tenant reform. In BC, we've just launched a provincial-wide campaign around comprehensive tenant reform, where we're looking at enforcement and many other things within kind of what falls under the provincial jurisdiction of tenants. In Ontario, we're fighting for real rent control, because there is some level of rent control, but as soon as the tenant moves out of their unit, they can jack it as high as they want, so we want the vacancy decontrol actually regulated. And we also are fighting for landlord licensing and effective tenant enforcement of the existing laws provincially. And then I'll just finish by talking about our remittance campaign. So our remittance campaign is, one of our newer campaigns that we're fighting, and our members really like this campaign. But in Canada, it's $500 million. It flows out of the country through places like Western Union and MoneyGram. And through our research, we discovered that the average rate that's being charged is around 15 to 20%. But even the World Bank says it should only be 5%. So it's a big gouge, and it's completely unregulated. So our members have been working really hard to work with the progressive, like the NDP parties in both Ontario and in BC, to put together private member bills to actually get this industry regulated. And we're starting in Ontario, and as Wade was saying, on May 31st, we'll be introducing the bill. It's a minority government, so we have the party that doesn't have the power introducing the bill. But the party that has the majority of the seats, the Liberals, they're not super opposed to this, so with a little hard work, we feel that we can actually move and win this, and it's a good campaign. And the Liberals' brand is tanking like a lead balloon, so hopefully we'll jump onto this. And I just wanted to take a second to introduce Kay Bisnath, who's our national president.
And Kay is also the president of ACORN International. We've done a double introduction for Kay. So, how do you put all this together? Clearly, Canada has a membership to build a level of resources that don't exist in Honduras or in Mexico or most of the places we work. Our members pay membership dues, but that is, you know, 40, 50 rupees a family in India can only get so much of the work done. Part of what we've been trying to do is build support from sort of people-to-people support, individuals who make monthly contributions to support the work of others. The other thing we've done is try to learn more about, particularly in the wake of what happened to ACORN in the United States, how to run the operation on a more self-sufficient basis. The most dramatic step we took was last year in the fall, and we bought a coffee house, a fair trade coffee house in New Orleans called Fair Grinds Coffee House, which had been the oldest and only exclusive fair trade coffee establishment in the city. We went into debt and bought it, and from that day forward, when we started managing it on October 15th, we converted it to a nonprofit so that $2,000 a month directly from the gross went to support the organizing in Mexico City, in Honduras, and in Lima, Peru. We're hoping to not only continue to, what do we know about small business? So, you know, we've run nonprofits for over 40 years. We do know something about nonprofits, but how we can make it big enough to support the rest of our offices in the Dominican Republic and Argentina and elsewhere in Latin America becomes part of the project. And one of the things we're trying to figure out is how to now do cooperative cafes that do the same with fair trade coffee in Mexico City and Tegucigalpa and maybe even in Lima, so that they can develop their own local support. These things take time. They, you know, in the United States, we just sort of took a risk. We were all in. We'd go into debt. That's a harder proposition in Latin America, but anticipating some of the questions of how you put together the support for this kind of thing. Unions, like the British Columbia Government Employees Union has been a big supporter of ACORN International, and others who are starting to see the connections of how the work done in some parts of the world also benefits other parts of the world, as well as our own creativity and whether or not we can put these pieces together. That becomes the excitement of trying to build something that's a little bit more resistant to attack than what we found in ACORN in the United States. So that's sort of the presentation we have in short, and you know, what's most interesting for all of us is always hearing what's on everybody else's mind. So, Arcelia, I don't know if you're going to moderate this, or Cliff, or me, but we certainly would love to have whatever questions are out there from our friends here in San Miguel.
Don't be shy. Mike, I can see you. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Mike, so.
She doesn't mind much.
Okay.
Cliff, you had some questions, I know. You told me earlier.
Yeah, I want to raise a question that is much broader. One of the things that Occupy Wall Street movement has done is to focus attention on the need for basic structural changes. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few and in large corporations has had a distorting effect on the political process and made people aware of the need for some basic structural changes. Now, at the same time, there's the kind of community organizing work that ACORN has done, which is very important work, empowering people, especially in poor communities, to win some gains around some of the immediate needs of those populations. And so the question I want to pose is, how does that connect with the larger need for structural change? I mean, there are those who have argued that, well, by organizing people at the base in society, that expands their consciousness and a sense of empowerment that can lead them to then make more fundamental demands on the system. But the question is, from your experience, has it led to that kind of leap to a larger political movement, or has community organizing ended up basically just addressing immediate problems that people have?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad I wrote it down and asked you to ask me. So, just to grab it by the horns, there's nothing about our work that's therapeutic. This is all about redistribution and building power. And I know you probably know this from reading my book, Citizen Wealth, but there's several chapters in here and charts about exactly our experience in the United States in moving money from private, large institutions like banks and community reinvestment. The passage of the Community Reinvestment Act in 1978 that allowed 20 million people to acquire homes for the first time. That's under assault, clearly, with the recession in the United States, for those of you familiar with our communities. And the other is these living wage campaigns when they're writ large. There are two types, or several types of living wage campaigns. The ones that we were most successful in the United States, and I think that most put a target on the back of the organization. It was not really voter registration after I left, but it was really, if you looked at the passage of minimum wage increases in Florida, Ohio, Arizona, state after state, the transfer of resources in 2004, when we first won the Florida one, was $1.5 billion to directly to 350,000 workers who got a raise of $1. So that's a $2,000 raise if you're working full time. That's not insignificant. It adds up to big numbers. And there was a chart in the New York Times recently about how the federal minimum wage in the United States is now losing its buying power in states that used to have a higher increase. And if you looked at the map of the states that still were higher than the federal minimum wage, those were the states where ACORN had won statewide minimum wage increases with an index for inflation. So those are direct transfers of literally billions of dollars. One outside study that's cited in the Citizen Wealth book that I wrote a couple of years ago showed a transfer of over $15 billion just in a simple array of campaigns over 10 years that ACORN was responsible for. So wherever it starts, stop signs, or, I've often argued that I think you could really take power in this world if you had solutions to loose dogs, bad drainage, and a couple of other issues. Garbage pickup. If you could solve those three things, that's a mass movement that you can't even estimate the size of. So that no matter where it starts, it's really not just an experience. It's a process of moving towards the ability to amalgamate larger and larger issues from those neighborhood bases to cities, to states, to federal levels. And obviously in the international operation, other than Canada, we're just in the early steps of that. But if you looked at 40 years history, 38 years when I was with ACORN, we got to that place by the last 10 years of the organization, which is unfortunately what put us in crosshairs in the periods after I left. But thanks for that question. Yes, sir.
last year we attended your.
Yeah, I thought I recognized you. Sorry, I'm not saying hi earlier.
And you had the woman from Mexico City, and I'm curious what's happening in Mexico City because.
Well, and I thought I was going to have her here with me today. So Yapa Amador, the same woman, is still working in Mexico City and still in the mesa. She had a health problem and didn't get back in gear in time. We're going to see her when we get back there tomorrow. The work is still focused in La Mesa, in the huge mega slum there, and it's been about water. How to get, there are certain areas, the squatting community 30 years ago with nobody there, now it's 3.5 million people in the state of Mexico, not the district, the federal district. And there's still huge gaps, 300,000, 400,000 people that don't have water. So that's been the campaign. They actually have some interesting handles, as we call it, in organizing, which are agreements that they had from the various water suppliers. It's really a cost issue. The government can't afford to run the sewer lines or commitments by private companies to do so that they haven't fulfilled. How do you get enough sort of popular support to force there to be some tension between the municipal and state governments and those private companies to force them to honor those agreements. So it's one of these almost sad things where you'll be visiting home to home and people will be showing you the letter they have from their utility company giving a date that's now long past when they were going to get potable water. Meanwhile, they have tankers that come through just like in the ones I see in Dharavi, you know, and in India that show up on a regular basis, fill their water containers, you know, 85-gallon, you know, barrels with water, and that's how you drink, you know, wash, everything else. So it's still a huge issue, and it's a resource thing. I mean, the problem, in not in your question, but in Cliff's earlier, is that an analysis that says the government has the resources in neoliberal context doesn't exist anymore. I mean, where the government might have had resources in 1968 when I first started organizing, and you could look at a certain way of organizing that if you put enough pressure on the municipal government and then you could leapfrog, I'm talking about the U.S. context, you could leapfrog over that city problem into the federal government, get some resources. Now with devolution and the conservative pushback as well as just the fiscal problem we have in country after country because of this huge recession, you don't have those resources, which is why you have to get private corporations to do their share, finally, to support basic infrastructure, and not just as well as redistribution. And I think a lot of the community organizing, you know, paradigm for this is shifting now, and that's part of why we're involved in the remittance campaign. If we just talked about poverty is a huge problem, look at the billion people, what do you do? When we talk about remittances, we're really talking about family-to-family program for migrant workers and families, where because it crosses national lines, it's unregulated and allows exploitation. If we could just get that 5%, we would almost triple the amount of aid money, if you look at that as a barometer, that's going into developing countries now, without a dollar of public money. But because banks are still controlling money transfers in too many areas, we haven't been able to get there. I see a question. I want to this issue of Honduras is very interesting, and we're going to be talking here in Mexico, back to your question. What they're doing is allowing people, migrant workers, to get Social Security credits. So if those migrant workers from Honduras enroll in the program, even though they may be working legally or illegally in the United States or in Spain or in Canada, they'll get credit so that at the point they repatriate to Honduras, maybe they'll only need to work 5 or 6 years in a formal economy to get full Social Security benefits when they retire. That's very exciting for Central American countries to finally embrace this amount. Exactly, okay. So we had a very good meeting with a Labor Department official about how we could help enroll people in the United States and Canada. And that that could affect 1 million workers right there. So that's a global problem, but immediately you talk about the Mexican context. If you could figure out a way that would work, both in terms of repatriation and credit. Yes, ma'am, at the back.
I recall the demonization of ACORN in the
Me
United
too.
States, but from the inside point of view, could you briefly explain how you got in the crosshairs and what you learned from that, as you mentioned?
Well, the learning goes on every day. The cheap and easy way I answer this question always is I left June 2nd, 2008, which was obviously right in the middle of that electoral cycle. After I left, who knew ACORN was, as they call it, the little-known ACORN, even though we had 500,000 members, we were in 38 states, et cetera, et cetera. But the voter registration problem came first because, as part of the long, ongoing strategy that went over 10 years, the Republicans thought the McCain-Obama race was going to be much closer than it turned out being. So as they had done in past years, they started challenging the voter registration being managed by ACORN as the largest registrant of low-income families. Those families are also disproportionately in the United States, Latino and African American. Those votes, even though it was a nonpartisan, often investigated registration effort, those votes inordinately go towards Democrats. That's true. So as that became an issue that McCain mentioned in the debate, Obama had to respond to the fact that Obama had served as an attorney on voter registration issues for us at some point in his career. All these things became part of the hot button that the Republican strategists hoped, if it was a close election and there was another Florida as there was for Bush in 2004, then they could say, hey, you had an ACORN problem of voter irregularities. The tragic thing about the mass base in the United States is that a year after, more than half of the Republicans surveyed believed that ACORN had actually stolen the election for Obama because of this registration effort. And a year ago, still 27% of the Republican base believed that Obama had not legitimately won the election, even though it was by a wide margin. So that was the first issue, and then the second issue was a year after that. There was a videographer, whatever you might call them. There was this whole pimp prostitute scam thing where they went into various offices of ACORN and claimed that they were getting housing counseling advice on how to set up houses of prostitution for Central American refugees or illegal immigrants. Now, that was a Fox News special. This guy Breitbart that just died. It turns out he paid $130,000 for that footage, and it was elaborately edited. But that's water under the bridge. The impact, one of those things after another, left the leadership of ACORN United States and its management singularly unprepared to deal with that assault across so many. And now it's become a systematic effort. I mean, Planned Parenthood was attacked in the same way, NPR, NEA, which is an education association. You're not anybody in the United States if you haven't been attacked this way now, it turns out. But because ACORN was the first, it was caught sort of flat-footed and without the sort of elaborate communications infrastructure. And that's one of the lessons that people keep trying to teach, is that ACORN should have had a better communication department, but I think that's a false lesson. What Planned Parenthood, led by Cecile Richards, did that was brilliant is when they were attacked, they waited in the gap on this Susan Komen Foundation and went to their base and essentially said, this is what's happening to us, it's withdrawing our money, support us or these services won't exist for poor families. And their base responded. And I think what ACORN did, which was the error that, you have to learn from, is they didn't go to their base. Instead, they took advice from outsiders and funders and others and believed that they couldn't survive and had to reformulate on a state basis and put the organization out of business. For an organizer, I mean, the rule of 7 in labor unions is common. As long as there are 7 members still willing to say they are part of that union or paying dues, you can't kill a union. And that's part of the historic charter of labor unions in North America. And that's part of what had infused the spirit of ACORN as well. But I think ACORN got sort of lost in that, and even as a membership organization, didn't just go back to its members. So that's one lesson. And the other lesson I talked about in this crazy coffee house example and a number of other things that ACORN International is doing is trying to learn how you control your resources better. To the degree ACORN in the United States got so big, there were too many voices about its money that its own membership couldn't control that debate. That was obviously a fatal Achilles heel that many of us will mourn for a long time. Other questions on that or any other topic? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was intrigued that you opened a fair trade coffee house in New Orleans. Are you planning any other cities?
Well,
Yeah.
you know, we're humble to this task. You know, so, and I believe any day we'll be breaking even. And I say that partially with my tongue in cheek, because obviously I've already admitted from the first day we'd be making money as a coffee house if we weren't supporting organizing. And you know, you can't, if you put too much of that organizing in a good cup of coffee, you'll make it too bitter for all of the folks who want to drink the coffee. So we really want to protect the coffee house. It's a great coffee house in New Orleans. We've been voted the most popular by the little weekly magazine, and we're trying to get the Times-Picayune, which is our, whatever, the hometown paper, to make us their best coffee house. But we actually would like to duplicate this in Latin America, where we think it's not originally how we stumbled onto this. Partially, we had partnerships in Honduras with some coffee growing, aloe vera growing cooperatives. And we thought, well, we'll help them get new markets in Canada and the United States. Well, that turns out to be hugely difficult. But in doing so, when we were thinking about fair trade, we stumbled onto this opportunity and took the giant leap. Now what we'd like to do is see if in Mexico City or maybe in San Miguel or whatever else, you could have a fair trade coffee house solely with coffee from that country, Café Cooperativa. And whatever money it made could support organizing directly there. Now that seems simpler than continuing to just do a north-south thing where you have coffee houses. I mean, to tell you the truth, we have trouble competing with Starbucks and all that. I mean, in the United States, for any of you who live there, they like a good bargain, and they're not necessarily willing to pay more for fair trade coffee, even though we're paying 4 times, 5 times for coffee what Starbucks or anybody else has to pay. Because you're paying a premium and they're paying for whatever Arabica coffee they can get. So we're trying to figure this out madly. We're a long way from it, and if we keep going this way, we would like to see if we could do something different. That's a great question. Any ideas? You know, I'll give you my email later. Yeah.
All the Canadians we know who live here, who have now gone back up to their land, have complained about their new government, and I was wondering why Harper has not gone after evil ACORN.
I'll let Judy answer that one.
You know, yeah, maybe we're just not big enough yet. They are going after like environmental non-for-profits and stuff pretty harshly. And you know, we did have a contract with the federal government on this. It was called this ESCO grant, and it was very, very small, and they had extra money in the pot left over. We were like enrolling people in this, as I called it, an American-style benefit, where it wasn't automatically triggered by your taxes. And they could have, our program person was like, yeah, I'm trying to get you guys more money to do more of this, and then she's like, you know what my boss said to me was like, let sleeping giants lie. So I think that they just don't see us as a big threat right now.
But there's also, I mean, the effort to create a sort of Fox News of Canada, which was a big issue last year, sort of fell on the shoals. I mean, they didn't manage to get that put together. And the sort of, the media frenzy that you need to launch this kind of assault, God bless them, the Canadian basic temperament doesn't go that way. So, and they don't have the tools to beat them up the head. So
We've noticed that. I mean, Americans fear coming here because we're being machine gunned every day. Whereas the Canadians don't seem to buy into that crap at all. I mean, it's
No, it's, I mean, if ACORN took on some, you know, huge national institution like drinking beer or something, then of course,
Game on.
Game on, they're dead. But as long as they stick to issues along the lines they're on, I think they're okay. But Canadians, you know, it's sort of, oh, that's down there in that crazy United States place. So they actually, we worry about this a lot, Judy and I, as we watch the vicious attack on ACORN in the United States. And when it first happened, I was actually in Toronto in Montreal with Judy when the first sort of Fox News video scams came out. And they'd call me on the cell phone and I'd literally say, God, I'm in Canada, you know, we don't really hardly have internet here. And sort of, you know, it all sort of, oh, okay, Canada, what a unique, exotic place. But it's hard to say. I thought I saw a hand. Yes.
Yes, you had just mentioned that ACORN was invited to come to Honduras, and I was just wondering how ACORN International goes to new places. Like how
you know, originally when there was an ACORN in the U.S., we were largely pushed there because it was members in the United States organization who were actually from other countries, particularly Dominican Republic, Mexico, Peru, and so forth and so on, who said, hey, we want that down there. We go back every once in a while, every year or two, and why isn't there an ACORN there? And eventually we sort of get towed down there. Now it's a funny thing. I mean, Honduras happened sort of tangentially because people seem to think of us when there's huge social dislocation, partially because of the sort of larger profile that ACORN got from the United States assault. So, you know, it's one of those Ghostbuster things. Who are you going to call when something, you know, all hell breaks loose? Well, ACORN's crazy enough. And, you know, and the second way is, and it's sort of funny because categorically, Facebook organizes no one. So, you know, if you ask me about that, that's the answer. It is a good communications tool. And it does, in this sort of new world, allow people to sort of jump over the fence and send you a Facebook message that says, hey, you know, I'm looking for you because you were involved with ACORN. We have this issue in Rome. Would you be interested in helping? And, you know, I've never been able to say no. And now people can find you in a different way than just sort of, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, where do you go? And that's been fascinating. We're about to start work in Liberia that happens that way, and a connection like that. Italy, the Czech Republic started a little bit like one of those Grateful Dead tribute bands. All of a sudden, these people in Prague, there's a new conservative government in Prague, created their own ACORN. And then after they already created ACORN, they got in touch with me. Then that was a train that already left the station, so I actually went to Prague this last fall just to find out what they were really doing. I didn't know if it was somewhat similar to what the rest of the ACORN world was doing, or if they were rebuilding the Communist Party and checking it. I had no idea. Because, you know, you go on Google Translate. I'm probably telling too much, but you go on Google Translate, you try to follow exactly what they're telling you, and you check, and you know, it's good issues and it's the right politics, but it is, you know, a different rhetoric than we're used to in North America, particularly. It's, you know, it's a little bit of an edge to it. You'd be more used to it in Cuba or somewhere. But you know, they turn out to be great people trying to make stuff happen, and the next thing you know, they're us and we're them, and that's why we're a federation. We're not sure exactly what's going on in every one of these countries, but it's, we think it's a good thing. Cliff? And then we're going to, one more question, we'll let you have the rest of your day.
Yeah, let me go back to my opening question about the need for structural change. You know, ACORN International does a lot of good organizing in the mega slums of the global south. And there is a need, though, to address the conditions that create these slums. You know, the enclosure of the commons that are forcing people off the land into into cities, because they can no longer make a go of it in the rural areas. I mean, Mike Davis's book, Planet of Slums, is
Mark's a good friend.
it's a really good portrait of that global phenomenon, really. And your comments a moment ago suggested one way in which ACORN is addressing that phenomenon, through fair trade coffee, buying at premium prices from cooperatives in the global south. Now, that raises, in my mind, the question of whether it would make sense for ACORN to put some of its organizing resources into the rural areas of the global south, creating cooperatives that makes it possible then for people to stay on the land rather than having to flee into the cities out of economic desperation. Is that a direction that you could see ACORN International moving?
Frankly, no. Population is moving to the cities, and if you look at the whole NGO world and where most developmental resources go, it's rural areas. So, in fact, we're trying to address something that's out of balance. And we don't particularly, and I answer this with humility, it's a struggle for us to build a sustainable model in cities with lots of people. In Arkansas, for anybody who's from the United States, that's not exactly an urban mecca. And that's where, in June 18th of 1970, I founded ACORN. So we had offices all over the state: Stuttgart in the rice country, Fort Smith, Fayetteville, and these Pine Bluff, which was the second largest city after the North Little Rock, only had 48,000 people. These were small communities, frankly. And we worked many campaigns and many organizing drives in very rural areas, there in South Dakota and Iowa, in the early years of ACORN. And as we couldn't amalgamate the resources, we couldn't sustain those areas. Because as a membership organization, the choice is either you go back to your base and put more of the weight on them to support the work, or you go outside. And I think now, categorically, it's proven if you're going to be an aggressive, social change-based organization of low and moderate income people, you can't necessarily survive. At least we don't know how you survive. And the proof evidence is the United States example thus far. So we don't know how to do that. So it's not like we say no, and it's not like we don't, anytime somebody asks us in a rural area to support their work, we do try to figure out a way to do that. But that, I'm not good enough. I'm not a good enough organizer. I don't know how to do that. I'm having trouble doing what we know how to do, but on the rural area where you spend more staff, more resources, I just don't see how it's going to be something that an organization like ours can do. I actually think if you wanted a program there, you'd have to aggressively try to move for change, not just in governments and corporations, but in the NGO sector. Because I think it's these government-washed NGOs, the Oxfams, the ActionAids, or whatever, who have hugely concentrated on rural areas, but not in a model that empowers or builds change. So when we deal with them in India, in Latin America, and Africa, the problem we have is these NGOs pay people to come to meetings, and they pay people to be leaders, so-called. Well, you're not going to get any autonomous or independent, or you're never going to have anybody advocate for change. It's more about continuing that process of washing the government money through an NGO into these communities and calling it rural development or calling it whatever. India's a perfect example. We've been running a campaign for 6 years to stop modification in FDI and retail to prevent large-scale Walmart, Carrefour, Metro from coming into India. It's still barred in that country's laws since the revolution. the NGOs are still out there trying to create a industrial model in agriculture that would actually help the logistical program of moving agricultural products into a Walmart-type logistical operation, even while we're going the other direction. So, this book I have, Global Grassroots, makes that argument even more aggressively. It's in the back, but like I say, I don't know, and I feel sometimes like we're not sure who the targets are, but in that area, in Africa particularly, it's the NGOs themselves that sometimes are the targets, not the governments, in terms of trying to redefine the paradigm. Great question.
Your